Transnet's failures will cost the country R1 billion per day in economic output. Lance Petersen from the Nelson Mandela Bay Business Chamber says this is almost 5% of GDP. He says a major problem is a lack of services in the South Corridor between the Eastern Cape and Gauteng. Petersen joins us now to discuss this further. Thank you so much for your time this morning, Lance. The fact that Transnet morning, Lance. The fact that Transnet is basically costing the country, R1 billion a day as far as economic output, that is equivalent to 4.9 of our country's annual GDP, or 353 billion rand. What are the type of measures that are currently being put in place to mitigate this? Business has been aware of it because business has been feeling the pinch, but the country also has been aware of this because of the lack of input that business has actually had in the GDP, and one of the pillars of that is because of infrastructure challenges.
Yeah, I think obviously there's been a lot of work between the presidency and big business, specifically around the National Logistics Crisis Committee. The lack of infrastructure is impacting the move of cargo onto rail that should be on rail, that's currently on road. And obviously there are multiple negative impacts of all this heavy cargo being on the road, traffic safety, the road conditions, the additional costs to the economy. And I think if you look at the manganese, it's a good example of the amount of trucks that's on the road now that should be on rail. And also there's an impact even in the local economy in Nelson Mandela, because the way it's handled has a negative impact on the environment and on the roads.
You mentioned the National Logistics Crisis Committee, that is in conjunction with government, is in private sector and government. What are the terms of reference for this committee? What are its objectives?
I think it's the same as Eskom had in terms of their crisis committee. The idea is to try and put as much focus on getting the rail working again, getting Transnet working again, because as it is, it's the lifeblood of the economy. There is a lot of focus on what the priorities are. We're waiting to hear from the NLCC what the priorities are, which corridors they're focusing on, so that they can put resources in, put infrastructure in place.
There is also the 100 million rand resource mobilization fund. Is that somehow going to be channeled and available for use by the committee for redevelopment?
Well, I'm hoping so, because I think that it takes this is the highest priority. I think probably more so than Eskom in terms of getting our economy moving again.
Talk to us, Lance, about another committee being formed. Do you think that this is the solution, or are there other alternatives that can actually be looked into that are perhaps faster as far as implementation is concerned, but also that will somehow not only bolster the state of infrastructure in the country, but also maintain it under government? Because what we are seeing here is a privatization process that is taking place here.
I think one of the ideals is that there's going to be a split between the infrastructure owner and then access to the line in terms of third-party access. The crisis committee is a good thing at the moment because it focuses all the attention and all the resources that we have. But going forward, there definitely has to be a split between government still owning and managing the infrastructure and third-party access, where we can look at productivity and reducing costs.
And tell us about the makeup of the NLCC. That the president will be chairing that, but who are the other stakeholders?
Yeah. I think if I look at last week's meeting, it's the CEOs of over 100 companies, and also the presidency. So we have, I think, Adrian Gore heading up business for South Africa side.
So really, I guess the top brass of CEOs in business. Now, one of the objectives there is to obviously open up the rail and the port networks to private operators. And I'm going to get back to this again. It's opening them up to private operators, but how much of an influence or how much of a control and oversight role is government still going to have in this operation?
I think the idea would still be that they have the rolling stock on the line, as well as managing the infrastructure itself. I think initially it would look at allowing slots on the rail line, with them still owning the actual equipment. As we know, there is an issue around getting the equipment back on rail because of the challenges they've had with the various OEMs that they're working with.
For clarity, could this almost be termed in layman's terms as some sort of a leasing agreement? Infrastructure still remains in the hands and the ownership of government, but there's some sort of a leasing relationship with private sector. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, they would be leasing the slots on the actual rail. They're possibly also looking at people putting their own infrastructure on as well. But there would have to be a longer-term commitment from Transnet in terms of how long those third parties would have access to the equipment.
And who would be responsible then for maintenance of the infrastructure in that quote-unquote leasing agreement? Would it fall on government to maintain the rails, or would it fall on the private sector to maintain the rails that they are themselves using?
I think my guess would be infrastructure should still fall under government, and the usage and management of the equipment should be as third party.
Lance Petersen from the Nelson Mandela Bay Business Chamber, thank you so much for your time and for that clarity there. The National Logistics Crisis Committee having been established with President Cyril Ramaphosa chairing that and presiding over that as chair. And it actually does remind me as well of the relationship that we are seeing prospectively in Tshwane, in Pretoria, with the power stations being leased out to companies to actually run. And that then becomes a source of financing and cash flow for government. But we'll keep abreast of developments on that side.